invite people into ways of life. And then we want to open today with there's a clip I'd like to share. This is actually from the movie Braveheart, and I asked if we could bring that up there.
Show mercy, oh, the great King, and win the respect of your own people. Even now, you are incapable of mercy. And you. That word is as unfamiliar as love.
Before he lost his powers of speech, he told me his one comfort was that he would live to know Wallace was dead.
Long at the throne, I swear.
Have you ever seen this movie? So, what struck you in that scene? If you were watching. What? Nothing? Okay.
Yeah, that he's so full of hate and he's dying.
Yeah. He's full of hate. He's dying and he can't let it go. There's another scene I had seen a friend of mine was sharing with, but it reminded me of this, and this is why I share this. It was from The Godfather. Have you seen The Godfather movies? And where basically it's like this, games for the power of taking people's lives, trying to control everyone. And the last scene in the movie is where he is, I think, sitting in this chair, and he dies. You see this person who had power over all these lives, and come to this feebleness, and even death comes to him. And in this movie too, it was very similar. This is this king who ruled oppressively and over people, and yet he can't even speak. And when she basically tells him everything you wanted I've undone, and he's later and he can't do anything about it because death comes to us all. And we've been talking about in many ways this issue of death. We've talked about death when others take the life of another. Do we take their lives? We talked about last week the sacredness of life at its beginning, and how do we deal with the issue of abortion and the issue of choice. And this week we're going to talk about the issue of the sacredness of life. And mainly the reason I wanted to share that scene is that line just strikes me. Death comes to us all. I mean, who does death not come to? And we like to deny it. I think that we live in this world that denies death. And how do we deal with it? When and what is life? When does death come? When is life at an end? And we talked about last week was the issue of abortion. I want to talk this week about what we call euthanasia. And when I first heard that, I kept thinking, what does this have to do with like young kids in China? because it sounds like it's a joke. But when you hear it the first time, you think youth in Asia, right? The word is actually from Greek, and the central word in youth in Asia is the word thanatos. Any of you know what thanatos comes from? Yeah, actually, we went to the Avengers yesterday, and the last little clip at the end, I had to look this up. They show, that was like a preview of the next movie, and there's this guy, and I have no idea, you just look up, and his name is Thanos, and he's this guy who's focused on death. Thanatos is death. Then the word youth in Asia comes from the EU in Greek means good. So it's a good death. So the question is, what is a good death? What does it mean to have a good death? I did my what's called CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education, in a hospital in Zion, Illinois, which is the Midwestern Regional Medical Center. And it was a hospital that focused on cancer. And not just cancer, but patients who've been told by their doctors that there was nothing they could do, that their cancer reached a point that there was nothing that could be done. And it was for people who didn't want to accept that felt that maybe there was something else. And so they would come to this hospital in hopes that there was something that no one else had tried, or there was something new that people were trying or someone who had a different opinion, that they would come here hoping for another, outlet of life. And for some, that's what they found, that they were able to find life where before they hadn't had it. But for many, that wasn't the case. That, the reality was that death was coming, and they had to face that. And I remember walking with this family. It was a man who was dying. His wife and her two sons were there, and I remember particularly because they were the age my sister and I were when my father had died. And for this mother, it was very. She felt helpful having me there to be able to be there with her sons, to be able to say I had been there as they went to their father to say goodbye to him. And that was a difficult thing to watch. And I've shared before of walking through this woman, this journey with this woman who had just found out that her cancer had metastasized to her brain, that she was going to die, that her daughter was moving her wedding up, and she was dealing with the fact that she knew that death was coming. The hard thing, though, being in this place is that what many times we see is that people who did not want to face that death was coming. I can remember this one woman, it was her brother who was in the hospital, and it was pretty clear that things were not going well. When I would visit with him, that often he would become sick. She would have to be there with this pitcher to catch, his vomit as he threw up, and then take it away from him. But yet, when we were there, we would never ever talk about issues like that. For her, she did not want to go there. In fact, I remember the one time that I actually had to be with him alone where I could talk, because I felt like he wanted to open up, but she didn't want to go there. And sometimes even faith can be something that helps, that becomes a hindrance for us as we try to deal with death. When I was there was a woman who was dying. It was very clear. They had tried everything, but she and her family listened to Benny Hinn. I don't know if you've ever heard of Benny Hinn. And one of Benny Hinn's big things is that if you have faith, then you can accomplish anything. And if what you believe is going to happen doesn't happen, then you must not have had enough faith. And so this family believed she would be healed, and she just had enough faith. So they couldn't ever talk about the possibility of her dying, because to do that would be to not have faith in God. And it was a real struggle trying to. I think you could see that she wanted them to be able to accept that she was dying, but they couldn't talk about that because it was, they would be to doubt God. And I think we need to wrestle with, where is God in the midst of this? And we want to talk about that. But when we talk about the issue of euthanasia, I think we need to talk a little bit about what has happened in our society with this issue. And I think there's a couple different things we need to talk about. One, what is euthanasia and what is not? And we have talk about whether it's passive or my mind's going.
Aggressive.
Huh?
Aggressive.
It's not the word they use, but yeah, active or passive, whether it's voluntary, non-voluntary, or involuntary, which are different things, and what that all means. And I can remember when I was in college, we had a class called Issues in Living and Dying, and it was the head of the religion department, who I think was very well respected. Everybody wanted to get in his classes, even if they weren't religion majors. And in fact, if you weren't a religion major, you had to be a junior or senior to get his classes. And he had one class called Issues in Living and Dying. And this was in the late 80s, and at the time, a lot of us talked about our culture's denial of death. I mean, for instance, when someone dies, what do we usually say happened? they passed away, they passed on, and we use things like that, and we try to soften it, and we want to deny that it actually happens. I mean, there are actually people who have enough wealth that they know they have this incurable disease. They have things set up so at the moment of death, their body is frozen in hopes that one day they'll have a cure for what they had, and they can thaw them out and bring them back to life. And there's immense amounts of money that go into these facilities to store these bodies because you don't want the freezer unit to go out, because they're hoping that maybe one day it can be brought back to life. Or think about in the funeral industry, and there's a lot of care that goes to people. I understand that, but think about the expense that we pay for funerals, and you get those caskets. What are the things they emphasize about them?
Airtight.
They're airtight, right? Nothing can get in or out. Like we got to protect this body. We don't want anything to happen to it. We don't want to talk about, well, what about having it just go back and for the body to, what's the word I'm looking for? Decompose, to rot. I think of watching Dead Poet Society where Robin Williams talks about it. He's pictures of these boys from years and years before, and he says, those boys are all food for worms. that we are. But we want to deny it. We have this fear of death and the reality of it, so we deny it and we try to avoid dealing with it. And you see that, I think you've seen this, especially at that time we were talking about in our medical field, that extreme measures were taken, to deal, that no case was hopeless. And one of the real cases that came forward, I don't know, how many of you remember Karen Ann Quinlan? You heard about that? You remember Karen Ann Quinlan? In the 70s, she was a 21-year-old young woman who went to a party where she had too much to drink and drugs and had seizures. Basically, she was brain dead, and they had her on a ventilator. It was the only thing keeping her body continuing to live. And the parents wanted her taken off the ventilator, but the hospital refused. They wouldn't let it, and the family could do nothing about it. Now for us now, that's something that's kind of surprising, but I can remember the professor in the class who was sharing that when his daughter had been young, that she had I think it was an emergency appendectomy. Thank you. Her appendix, had to be removed, and she was very young, and she had to spend the night in the hospital. And they were told as parents that they couldn't stay. And you know what they did? They just laughed. Because he said, back then that was where he stood. The doctor said that you did it. They knew, and you had to follow it. He said his daughter years later still shared how that was so traumatic for her, and that she still had carried that with her. That having been left there as a young girl in this difficult place in the hospital without her parents there. Nowadays we wouldn't accept that, but think about it. If you've watched the movie Patch Adams, there's this great scene where the doctor says, you are gods. He said, you have the power of life or death. And I can even remember when I was at CPE, again, in the hospital, when I was visiting with this woman, and the doctor came in and basically expected I would just leave because he was the doctor and he was, what was important there. And asked, turned to the woman saying, is this what you want? Which was not what he was going to give her a choice. So we live in this culture where for the longest time we said, this medical field, they have the choice in life and everything, had to be done to preserve life. One of the things they found with the family of Karen Ann Quinlan finally won their suit and were able to take her off this ventilator that was keeping her body moving, is that they discovered that her brain had completely liquefied. There was nothing there anymore, And so this time has gone on. The courts have basically said that, that there's a difference between bringing life, and when a time to die has come, that there is a time when we need to let people die, that the end has come. And they've even ruled that removing the feeding tubes if someone is in that case, and the number of times that kind of thing has happened, that we're doing what's called extreme measures. And coming out of that, we've had living wills and the other word went out of my mind. I know, it's been one of those days, I'm sorry. But basically where we can say our wishes if we ever come to that kind of situation.